Here we are again, and Robbie's with me, but before I bring him in formally, let me just say welcome to everybody, and we'll go into pre-show mode just briefly, and just to give people a chance to come in. As you see there, Robbie's teed up, ready to come in. The studio's running, so Robbie's over there, ready to come in. I've got the controls here, I've got the chat there, I've got the multi-view here, and everything's running pretty well, fingers crossed. And then of course we have the doggies who are in their baskets looking as though they've not moved. They do move from time to time, but hopefully they'll keep quiet over the next hour and a half. They do have this habit of waking up when somebody goes past or visits, because of course this time of day in the UK it's 9 o'clock, just after 9, so the dogs get quite excited when things go. But there we go, it's pretty good, and great to see so many on already, some new names, so welcome if you've not been here before. Just to explain, we run the pre-show for about a minute or so to allow people to come in, and then I start the formal show, which I'm going to do straight away. So stand by, and I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 24th of October 2023. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on board, and a very important conversation this evening with Robbie. So much to talk about, because in so many ways I feel we're on the brink of things, on the brink of war, on the brink of a financial services crisis, potentially with the bond markets where it is. More broadly, we've got a lot of households in significant difficulty. And if we look more broadly around the world, there are crises left, right and centre. So I want to spend a bit of time this evening exploring some of those things and trying to get to some of the underlying drivers. Why are we where we are? And what can we do to perhaps change the trajectory of things? So that's the plan. Before I do that, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific legal or financial or property advice. This is a general conversation only. The chat is moderated, but feel free to throw your comments in. And this is as of 24th of October 23 if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a specific question, and you're very welcome to do that, use @WalkTheWorld. That means it gets into my queue, and then I can make sure that it comes through. And if you'd like to get your question to the list, you can use Super Chat, which I've enabled, or indeed if you'd like to make a contribution to what we do more broadly. We do this because we think there's a very important conversation to have, not for profit motives, but anything that people contribute helps us to keep the shows going and to develop our content, so always greatly appreciated. Anyway, before I just bring Robbie in, let me just make another point. YouTube has changed the algorithm insofar that adverts pop up without me controlling them at all, so I always turned adverts off during the live stream. I can't find a way to turn them off again, so I apologize if you get an advert. It's nothing to do with me, it's YouTube. They're taking over. Anyway, let me bring Robbie in. Hi there, Robbie, how are you doing?
Hi, Martin. Very good. How are you?
Yeah, very good. And look, great to catch up again. A lot to talk about tonight. But before we get into the detail, I guess my question: have you ever known a time when there were so many levels of uncertainty around the place? Because I've been on this planet for quite a few years, and I don't think I can remember a time when there were just so many things wobbling wherever you look.
No. Are we on the brink of catastrophe, or are we on the brink of potentially unprecedented progress? That's what I would like to think. There's an alternative to catastrophe. What's the saying that in some language, maybe it's Chinese, the word crisis is the same as the word for opportunity.
Yeah.
But no, to seriously answer your question, it certainly doesn't seem like it. And I think there's a clash of systems that we're dealing with, and we tend to look at the world through an Anglo-centric sphere. And one of the mistakes, one of the flaws of our upbringing when you live in a country like Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom, you actually think that your version of the world is the version of the world. World history revolves around your countries. That's all you're taught. But there's a much bigger world out there, and it's leaving us behind. And we're on the side that's pointing the finger at everyone, saying, you're a bad country, you're a bad country, you're a bad country. And it's not necessarily true. That kind of attitude is making the world a very dangerous place. And so you have that sense of impending catastrophe in geopolitical, geostrategic terms, military terms, combined with just what you and I have always been talking about since we've known each other. Has the can finally reached the point where it can't be kicked down the road anymore? And that seems to be happening right now as well. So, yeah, I don't think I've ever felt it quite this way.
No, but I think it's also important, Robbie, as you say, not just to look on the negative and say it's all, falling apart and nothing we can do. The point is there are things we can do and should be doing.
Sure.
And I actually think that getting democracy to work for us at this time is probably more critical than ever before, because we should be questioning the things that people don't want to question because they don't have to go like that. There are alternatives. And, if I take the, the discussion about the cash ban or branch closures, right? Until a year plus ago, everyone said, well, that's just the way that it is. It's progress. The digital world is driving you there. We know, of course, that there's a much more powerful story to be told here. And it's very important people understand what's really going on. And as we've shown, if we get the can opener out and open it up and, expose it, then you actually realize that the agenda that people were assuming to be happening wasn't the agenda that was happening. And it takes you into a different way of thinking. And I think that hopefully one of the things we can do on this show is to show people that there are different ways to think about some of these issues, and just taking the, if you like, the mainstream doctrinal view of neoliberalism, of the markets must win at all costs, and well, if people get crushed in the crossfire, never mind, it's nothing to do with us, sort of thing. There's a different world out there, and just to give you another example, Robbie, I was listening today to somebody speaking in Canberra who's, I think, a new head of the regional doctors. And he was saying, in regional Australia, the medical services are being hollowed out left, right and centre. So it's harder and harder and harder to find any medical services being provided in many regional towns. And if you overlay that with what we've been talking about with regard to the removal of branches in those towns and the removal of cash in those towns, and the fact that the digital world has not really reached into the regional Australia, again, it's another example where so many things are putting pressure on the regional economies. And of course, the hearings over the last few months have really, underscored this, haven't they?
No, they have. And, Martin, people have been dazed and confused by where society has gone because, not everyone's 12. We've got some kind of historical memory of how things functioned in the past. And we've gone from a situation where problems could be solved, where seemingly problems no longer can be solved. And you're thinking, that doesn't make sense what they're saying about, take the case of, why can't we solve the problem of doctors in the regions? Why did we have them in the past and now we can't provide those kind of services or other services in the regions? And people can't make sense of it. They're dazed and confused. But this is a byproduct of not the physics of the physical universe having changed, but an ideology has changed. The ideology of neoliberalism that brainwashed us into a certain way of doing things. And one of the things that brainwashed us into is don't expect governments to be able to solve problems. It started off really almost in a comedy fashion with the great Ronald Reagan. Government isn't the solution of the problem. Government is the problem. Right, it just went downhill from there. A lot of people still think that. There's people watching the show right now that think that. And what the problem is, they've come to because they haven't expected governments to solve the problem. They haven't organised themselves as the people who elect the government to make sure they elect a competent government, right? And if they haven't elected a competent government, organise themselves to put pressure on that government to make sure it works competently. That's what we should have been doing all along, and we haven't done it. And so we've become used to this failed model. And our argument is, from the beginning, the ideology came first, and we have to recognise that and change it. I don't care what your ideology is, what your skepticism is about government, whether you support big government or little government, you want competent government. And we should be demanding that. And so what we've done in this show is encourage people to get involved in the processes that influence government. Now, there may be some pretty nasty characters who sit around boardrooms behind closed doors in the dark, smoking cigars, who are the main people who control government. But as the great Percy Shelley said, Martin, we are many, they are few. And if the public actually organise themselves to influence the government, then they can overwhelm that. And we have to keep pushing and demanding that, because we should not settle for having a country like Australia where the regions, with all the potential out there, don't have doctors. We shouldn't settle for that. So what do you have to do to solve the problem? Well, I can't tell you right now what you have to do to solve the problem. But you know what? On our show last week, we discussed, Elisa Barwick and I discussed some of this, a variation of this, or a contrast to this, which is the Far East of Russia. And the Russian government, that dreadful despot Vladimir Putin, all the different initiatives the Russian government is rolling out right now to encourage people to go and settle the far regions of Eastern Russia. And that includes things like 2% fixed interest rate mortgages, for the life of the mortgage. That includes all kinds of investment in infrastructure. That includes other incentives. When you have a government that's committed to solving the problem, there's one example of a government that's actually doing it, right? In that particular case. So there's a similarity to Australia. We have a remote centre of our country, but it's got a lot more potential than we're taking advantage of, and that the inner city Greens will believe. We just need someone who wants to fulfil that potential, right? And I'm confident we could solve the problem. So yeah, let's get some thinking brought to bear that's actually committed to solving these problems, rather than just putting up with them and then hoping the gods of the economy don't come and smash us with some kind of economic catastrophe while we're just thinking of our own butts.
Right, and just on neoliberalism, it's worth just unpacking that slightly more, right? Because there are a couple of stems to it. The first stem relates to the markets must be the markets. We can't interfere with the markets. It's the market. It's that all-powerful God that's driving everything, right? The second leg of the stool is, of course, the very large money powers, and that's including many corporates, and of course, on the international stage, a lot of the big tech companies are now in the same class as well, who are able to have huge influence on the political process that essentially then percolates down into policies. So it means that people like the banks and people like big tech, et cetera, are in a position to exert huge influence on what politics sees as normal. The third leg of the stool is the neoliberalism within Treasury. So Treasury has a particular view of the world about, again, the way markets work and the fact that you can do this and you can't do that. Look at the massive migration, right? Migration is seen as a tool to, bring more people into the country. Now, whether that's the good thing or a bad thing, at the moment the doctrine is big Australia is good and bigger is better. Again, that's an assumption that's there. So wherever you look, there are a series of assumptions. And then just to follow the fourth leg of the stool, there are a series of international agencies that sit above some of this, and I'm thinking things like the World Economic Forum and those guys, who again are seeded through with this same neoliberal view, and of course are connected with those very influential, like Davos, for example, very strongly connected with that power that we spoke. So there's a bunch of stuff that comes down and percolates down into government. So that's essentially the structure that we've got. None of this is actually built from the interests of the people. None of this is actually thinking about what local people need in Australia or wherever else, right? So that's the superstructure. that's driving it. And as you quite rightly say, it's partly because of the Westminster system of governments and all that sort of stuff, and the Western way of thinking as well is part of it. But to me, this neoliberal driver set is critical to understand and to unpack.
Yeah, I think you've covered it quite well, and it's actually quite anti-democratic. If you look at those elements that you've laid out there, the most democratic one, in a sense, is the first one, the market, because we're all part of the market too, right? So the market is our collective hive mind. Is supposed to magically make the economy work, but of course we're not a hive mind. So we just, it's the sum total of our consumption decisions as supposedly the market. But there is no market that exists in a vacuum, and so the second one straight away distorts the first, and that's the big corporate vested interest, and that was always going to be the two can't exist without each other, because if the market is governed by laissez-faire survival of the fittest, then it's the big predators of the jungle that survive, and they are the big corporate interests, right? And they're always going to dominate that kind of market. There's no other way the system has ever worked. And so, yeah, this is quite an anti-democratic system. And what was your third? You had a good third element there. Which was Treasury. And I wanted to point this Treasury in Australia. Treasury has made this decision that has affected me straight away. Right, I've been affected by this. People who watch my show might have heard me say we were ordered out of our house. This house. I mean, now we will not be here much longer. We've been long-term renters, and our landlord wants to sell, and so we want to find somewhere affordable. And man, you've never seen so many queues at a house. I mean, the one house that we've looked at in the last 6 weeks that had a 4 in front of the weekly price. There was only one that we found. I've never seen so many people come to a house inspection in my life. It was enormous. And we just, thought, forget about that. Anyway, we've got some alternatives that we're looking at. But what are we competing with? We're competing with this Treasury decision to bring in all these people. But why is that something Treasury wants to do, to bring in all these people? Because this is the same Treasury that believes in laissez-faire and neoliberalism. And so what they think they're bringing in, Treasury thinks they're not breaking the rules of neoliberalism, Martin, by bringing in all these people. They're just expanding the market. That's their logic, right? Expand the market, create more demand by expanding the market, but it's the market that will govern all this. That's what they're thinking. The market must make the decision. We'll just make it bigger and bring in more people to increase the demand, to put the pressures on where those decisions need to be. That's the solution to this. And if you think about it, it's cheating. They've had to find a loophole in their market economy structure because it actually fundamentally doesn't work and can't work and never could work. And we're the only damn generation that's ever believed this way, right? We've degressed as a civilization to believing this kind of utter rubbish, because nowhere in human history have people, decided to give up the rational action of making decisions to some hidden hand, as Adam Smith called it, to some undefined spiritual presence almost, which will make the decisions about where the economy could lead. And it was always a scam. It was always a fraud. And the proof of that is go look at the number of the great economists of liberalism, including the great John Stuart Mill, who is a god to these people, this thinking. And they all work for the one company, the East India Company, the biggest monopoly in the history of the earth. It was never a free market. It was always a monopoly. It looted $45 trillion out of India, the equivalent of $45 trillion out of India, made a bunch of POMs immensely wealthy, right? And they employed all these economists who brainwashed us into this idea of the free market. The other cheat, so this thing that the Treasury has done, bringing in all these people, I think it's 600,000 this year. And I actually support a big Australia. I want to back that up in a minute, right? I support a big Australia, but I support a smaller Melbourne and a smaller Sydney and a smaller Brisbane. You can have both. You don't have to have everyone crammed in these big cities. The other way they cheat, Martin, is if you listen to the politicians who espouse this kind of neoliberalism, they will tell you the number one function of government, because I don't believe in government, remember. So they enunciate what is the number one function of government, the number one responsibility of government. It's not welfare for the people. It's not anything like that. It's not building infrastructure. No, they won't tell you that. The number one responsibility of government is to keep people safe, i.e., it's a military responsibility. Having a military, having an army, war is the only legitimate role of government in these people's minds. And that allows them to cheat too, because then they don't hesitate at spending taxpayers' money, right, to essentially stimulate the economy, because the economy wouldn't work otherwise. They find ways to stimulate the economy through war. And if you're paying attention to Australia right now, that's the only thing that's coming out of the Albanese government and in terms of stimulating the economy. And that's what's, apart from the population thing, and that's what they've continued from the previous government, right? All the industries they're talking about booming in Australia are all military industries. What the hell? Old Labor politicians of yesteryear who built this country would literally roll over in their graves that the only thing we think is legitimate and we can do is anything to do with defence industries. That's what Australia is going to invest in now. So we can all build a bunch of weapons and we can all try and sell them to Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia keeps buying the damn things. Like, it's a joke. Whereas we could be, instead of investing in weapons like that because that's a loophole, that's the only way to keep your damn neoliberal economy going, invest in the regions of Australia, right? Invest in the infrastructure, invest in the industries out there. There's enormous potential to do that. And we could be running a very different kind of economy and country if we took that approach.
Yeah, and just on that, of course, Albo is in the US at the moment. And it's interesting to ask the question, why is he in the US at the moment, right? And it's interesting that there's a particular bill which is potentially stacked up in the US, and Albo is basically being used, I would argue, to help facilitate that bill in the US. And while he's over there, it's nothing to do with Assange. It's actually all to do with a certain submarine set.
Yeah, this is really shameful, and I'm deeply ashamed that our country's come to this. So if people aren't aware, Joe Biden is in a war with the US House of Representatives because there's a rebellion in the House of Representatives over continuing to fund the Ukraine war. Now, Martin, 18 months ago, you got me on this show the week before Russia's invasion of Ukraine started, right? And we talked about what might happen, and I gave you my perspective on it, etc. So what this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a proxy war between Russia and the United States. That's what's actually happening. And the American politicians, and if I had more time, I should have done some preparation. I've got to queued up all these videos of American politicians who want the war, they run television ads on this saying, this is the best war we've ever fought in because we're not the ones dying. All we've got to do is fund them. And when we fund them, the money stays here because it goes to our weapons manufacturers to make the weapons to go over there. And it's the Ukrainians that are dying. And that's why 2 months into the war, when Ukraine wanted, Gerhard Schroeder is the latest person to confirm this, the former Chancellor of Germany, when Ukraine wanted to negotiate a peace deal, the Americans and the Brits wouldn't let him do it. That's what Gerhard Schroeder did. They weren't allowed to negotiate for peace because there's been too much money made out of this. But that's the military-industrial complex in America. The actual American politicians, and especially in the Republican Party, ironically enough, who have become the party of peace. I never thought I'd say that after 2003. Well, not totally the party of peace, but there's a rebellion in that party. They arced up about continuing to pay this bill. It's been well over $100 billion. I forget what it's up to now, but it's well over $100 billion that the American government has paid for weapons in Ukraine. And so they brought down the speaker over that. All the drama recently with the Speaker of the House losing was triggered by this unwillingness to keep paying the bill that the American president and the establishment and the military-industrial complex want them to keep paying. So Biden has put up a bill to the Congress to keep, now that the Israel-Gaza thing has happened, and that's a terrible thing, of course. But if you know American politics, there's no cause they're more devoted to than the cause of Israel. So Biden is cynically using the Israel catastrophe to put up a bill in the US Congress to keep funding Ukraine, fund Israel, fund Taiwan, and fund AUKUS, the Australia, United Kingdom, United States. Now, the funding for AUKUS is token. It's a few $1 billion for some incidental thing that the Americans have to do, right? Because we're paying for AUKUS, not the Americans. Australia's going to pay the $368 billion, but there's an earmarking here for AUKUS that's in this bill. And so here's Albanese, just as he goes to America, he's there in time, and it's actually raised questions about foreign interference, by the way. He's there in time, and he's expected to lobby the US Congress to pass this bill for the good old Aussies' sake, even though 1% of it is money related to us, and the rest of it is to keep funding these damn forever wars that America has started. And our Prime Minister is over there lobbying for that so that those wars can keep being funded. We get something gets spent on AUKUS, whatever the hell it is. And I'm thinking, well, if that's actually what he's there to do, lobby for that, so that we have the pleasure one day of spending $368 billion, what's he actually going to be doing for what should be, by now, the number one issue between him and Joe Biden, which is the fate of Julian Assange? The whole country is sick of what's happened to Julian Assange. He has enormous public support. It's the only reason all these politicians are talking about it. Albo knows that. But he's so weak. And even though he's doing Biden the biggest favor of his life, I've got no confidence he's even going to mention Assange on this trip. And if you think about that, that is deeply, deeply shameful that our Prime Minister would, essentially, I think it's a humiliation for our country, the way this politics is playing out. But in a war atmosphere, which they've created, the media is not going to highlight this, or not very much, and the average person probably won't even know about it and just shrug and whatever. And the debasement of Australia as a nation continues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been said, and I think it's probably true, that Australia and the US are very strongly aligned around those ideological platforms that we've been talking about. But there are consequences of that in terms of where we spend money, where we don't spend money. And I guess the other question that you've got to think about is the more that we actually allow the military build-up in and around Australia, that changes the power balance in the region that we're part of.
Look, we've painted a great big target on ourselves, legitimately so. You got out of Wollongong just in time, because if Wollongong becomes the base of the nuclear submarines, that's a legitimate target. If Newcastle becomes the base of the nuclear submarines, that's a legitimate target. Wherever that base is becomes a legitimate target. Pine Gap is already a legitimate target in a major showdown, but we are adding to that. Also, Albanese has these other deals with the Biden administration, and one of them is this. It's called the IRA Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and although those words don't really relate to the content of the bill, it's a cover. It's a cover for the US government to basically direct subsidized investment into Australia to take over our mines, especially on strategic minerals. So this will be subsidized investment that's coming in here, and other investors will not be able to compete with this. And this is an actual intention to take over our mines. And Albanese has sold it as, oh, look, we have a leg up. We have a special entree into the American economy with our resources. Isn't that great? The only other country that's had this entree is the Canadians, right? Now we get it as well. But what they're not emphasizing is the reality. It's actually giving up our control. Because once you do these kind of deals with the United States government, you lose all control. Now, we're already seeing that we've helped at the moment. We're helping to promote a petition by the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, calling for the cancellation. It's a parliamentary petition, and maybe we can put a link up somewhere. It's a parliamentary petition, online petition, which means you sign at the parliament. It only runs for 4 weeks, but it's calling for the cancellation of the forced posture agreement. This was an agreement signed in 2014, but this is the agreement that remember when Barack Obama came out to Australia with Julia Gillard and they announced the troops in Darwin, the Marines in Darwin. This agreement has flowed on from that, and it's actually the biggest carver of our sovereignty in our history, because it's given the Americans total control over what they set up in Australia as military bases. And you've got this massive airfield up in Darwin, where America is now flying in and parking these B-52 bombers, which are, quote unquote, nuclear capable. But the Americans refuse to say whether they'll have nuclear weapons on them or not. And the reason they refuse to say that is because, well, they never tell it anyway, but it's illegal if they do under Australian law. And by Australian law, I mean our own treaty arrangements with the South Pacific. We're a signatory to a Pacific treaty where we agree to never have nuclear weapons on our soil. We're allowing, and it was really painful watching a couple of months ago in Senate estimates, David Shoebridge, I think it was, the Green senator, quizzing Penny Wong on this, and it was the most painful torture you've ever seen. What Penny Wong was doing to herself, twisting herself in knots to try and justify why letting these B-52s be parked here was okay, even though she couldn't. It was, Schrodinger's nuclear weapons, right? She couldn't say whether they did or didn't have nuclear weapons, but the fact she couldn't say they didn't meant that should be illegal straight away, but she was trying to justify it wasn't illegal. So that's the sort of stuff we're doing to ourselves. And under this forced posture agreement, those bases are under total American control. We agree to say we will not have any say over them at all, even though they're in our sovereign territory. And I spoke to an American expert, one of the best foreign policy minds I've ever experienced. This guy, I won't use his name because I got to talk to him directly. But this is an American, a top American. And this is a guy who used to advise people like Richard Nixon. And he's an older guy now. And he pointed out to me that this Australian forced posture agreement, Martin, has its roots in terms of the type of agreement in America's occupation of Japan and Germany after World War II. So, and what was an occupation of those countries is the legal foundation of what Australia has signed onto with this forced posture agreement. That is, kiss our sovereignty goodbye, right? So those things have made us more of targets. And then the other one is that Albo has announced is we're going to be manufacturing missiles in Australia as part of our defence industry. Yay, missiles. Well, I don't know. I think they might have been talking about a bunch of factories somewhere, right? Every single one of those factories, the viewers of this show should pay attention to where these factories get set up, because wherever they're set up, they're all targets. They're all legitimate targets, right? And if the worst case scenario, they are all legitimate targets. And so you think, man, how bad is it that we've been prepared to put ourselves at risk like this? What is this fiendish threat that justifies this risk that we're prepared to expose ourselves to? This must be a really bad threat. Well, that threat is the country that's just made every damn winemaker in Australia jump for joy this week because they're going to start importing our wine again. Hey, it's our biggest trading partner. What the? Sorry. My God. We're doing all this for the country that is our biggest trading partner. While we've been going around the world starting wars, they haven't been going around the world starting wars. They've been doing the opposite of starting wars. They've been building infrastructure all around the world. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's now an independent candidate in America. Finally, I heard one American acknowledge the fundamental difference between American foreign policy and American presidential candidate, between American foreign policy and China's foreign policy, because we have been complicit in just these forever wars, and they're called forever wars because the Americans have turned against them. Half the American population is sick to death of them, but America's economy is built on nothing but, so they have to keep them going. And they're demonizing the country that hasn't done that and done the opposite of that. And we've given up our sovereignty and made ourselves a target because we are actually contemplating entering into a war against that country. We are mad, man.
Yeah, absolutely. You wonder when you stand back and think about the agenda and the implications of the agenda. And again, I wonder how much of this was actually in the minds of Australians when they voted and when they vote. To what extent is this being done below the covers? And I also want to make the point here, Robbie, that there are a number of independent agencies and advice centres that spend a lot of time publishing reports and statistics, which of course, are dressed up as objective independent reports and statistics, but are absolutely lead-laden with particular ideological views, which essentially are then used to justify a particular position. And unfortunately, a lot of those agencies, some in Australia, some in the US, some in other places around the world, don't really disclose how they're funded. They don't really disclose the ideological basis on which they're actually reporting, and yet have a huge influence on the way that policy is formulated and the way that the media reports about it.
Yep. And it's a cancer on the way our politics works. But it's where real influence is conduited into the system. Yeah, Ralph, I'm responding to Ralph Barwick, PhD there. Welcome, Ralph. I'm glad you could take time off your virus research. It's the IPA, it's the Hoover Institute, but specific, that even more relevant to what we've just been discussing now is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra, to a slightly lesser degree, but not much, the Lowy Institute. And you got, and they're sort of echoes of these big American ones like the Hudson Institute, the Center for a New American Security now is another one, CNAS, the Center for a New American Security. And you look at their funding, and they're all funded by the military-industrial complex. And the reason that's a term that should be used, a lot more, is because, an American president warned about this thing, right? That if you let war become a business, and people make money out of it, they will take over your system. And that was what Eisenhower warned in 1960, and that's exactly what has happened. So in Australia, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has been pumping out all this stuff to demonise China and put Australians in a frame of mind that when deranged people like Peter Dutton, like on Anzac Day 2022, say we must prepare for war, somehow we think that's a reasonable proposition. Now, our party was prepared to upset even a lot of our own supporters when we decided in 2020 we better start taking this stuff head on. But I want to give you an example, and this is a bit controversial, and I don't want to get too distracted in the controversy of it, but I've got to say this because this is an example of the extreme hypocrisy. So look, a terrible terrorist attack happened on the 7th of October in Israel. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think it's a straightforward picture, because while there were horrible massacres that occurred and they're being blamed on Hamas, there were also factions of this attack that treated people quite well. The Israeli people who dealt with them testified to that. They were treated quite humanely. And there's other conflicting reports about, the fight back by Israeli soldiers might have killed a bunch of people as well. And then we've got this blizzard of information war, and what's coming out of the Israeli government, which is run by one of the biggest thugs in the world, in Benjamin Netanyahu. So he's the guy who's built his whole career on, we've got to be tough on the Palestinians to keep Israel safe. Well, then by that measure, he failed. He's the biggest failure in Israeli politics, because he didn't keep his people safe. Under his watch, they got slaughtered. And you know who sees it that way?
80% of the Israeli people, they hate him. They're blaming, the opinion polls are showing him, they're blaming him. But because he's backed up by the Americans and us, and we just parrot this stuff. So their retaliation, and I'm not saying it wasn't a terrible terrorist attack, but they're retaliating now, and everyone's heard of Gaza, right? And so the terrorists came out of Gaza, so Gaza is going to be punished, and they're all locked in there, and they're having, the hell rain down on them, right? And that's the state of play, and it's it's definitely going to get worse before it gets better. Why I'm raising that is because last week the United Kingdom got 50 countries to sign on to a statement condemning China for its treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And what China did to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang was a response to also a terrible wave of terrorism, killed 800 people in a decade, up to 2017. And China responded to that with a de-radicalization and poverty reduction program. And the de-radicalization involved getting people into retraining centers to learn skills so they could be able to have a different economic way of life and income, etc. And that was a big part of it. Now, it took a lot of security as well. Of course they did. There was a terrible terrorist problem. But they didn't bomb anybody. They didn't execute anybody. They executed convicted terrorists, but, in a normal way, not through this kind of indiscriminate bombing. They didn't do any of that. And then they actually did, lift poverty. Go look up pictures of Urumqi at night, Urumqi, the capital city of Xinjiang. I mean, this is an advanced, spectacular modern city. And the Chinese built all this up. Now, are they authoritarian? Yeah, by American libertarian standards. I shared with some of my libertarian friends the other day a good video from the 80s where the American government introduced compulsory seatbelt laws, and all these people were complaining about it and calling, and you weren't allowed to drink and drive anymore. And all these Americans were saying, we're becoming communist. I mean, it's all relative. Anyway, by those standards, yeah, what China did was authoritarian. But it worked. They didn't mass slaughter anybody. But the Americans in 2018 called it genocide. They told us there were concentration camps. And they used outfits like ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, to do it, right? And ASPI started producing all these reports saying that, they were softening us up for war. Oh, we're up against, this is the worst genocide since the Holocaust. That's actually what they said, a genocide that killed not one person, nobody. There was no death toll. I was interviewed by a stupid SBS reporter who was attacking me over something I did in relation to this in the public sphere that people might have seen on video. And when he actually mentioned mass graves, when he talked to me about this so-called genocide in Xinjiang, I said, oh, hang on. Because you heard the word genocide, you assume there's mass graves. Do you know not even the American government claims there's mass graves? Because they're actually not, they can't say there's that kind of genocide going on because nobody's died. They've totally, abominated the language here to get their propaganda across. Anyway, so anyone who knows the Citizens Party, we've been trying to expose this particular lie for a long time. Well, if you needed any more proof, last week when the British government got 50 countries, of which one was a Muslim country, Albania, only one Muslim country joined this condemnation. All the other Muslim countries in the world support what China's done to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So if that doesn't convince you, what you should be convinced by is that one of those 50 countries condemning China for its treatment of Muslims last week was Israel. The Netanyahu government condemned China last week for its treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang. Give me a break. This is the kind of in-your-face, rub the crap in your face propaganda that we've had pumped into us, and it's so gratuitous. We think, well, it can't not be true. I mean, surely they couldn't be that shameless. Yes, they are that shameless. They absolutely are that shameless. And outfits like this Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Australia, ASPI, that's why we put out a video of it. It's the most sinister presence in Australia right now. They're the ones that have brought us to the brink. We're even contemplating a war. It is nuts. It is absolutely nuts. And people, I see these signs of an awakening. There's never been greater distrust in government. But what really infuriates me, Martin, is all these people who will happily tell you how much they distrust government. Suddenly, when it comes to one country, China, they're happy to gullibly swallow everything they're told. And I can't help but think there might be a racial component to it. I'm not sure. And if there is, search hard about that and snap out of it, because it's not justified. You've got to look around the world, and if you actually look through it objectively, you would be terrified, not of China, but what we're missing out on because of our small-mindedness and our bigotry and our sycophancy to the United States and the United Kingdom. Because last week, the biggest event in the world wasn't Gaza. The biggest event in the world was the Third Belt and Road Forum in China, and all the countries of the world, or all the ones that aren't up themselves, went there to participate in that, because that's the future. All these countries recognize they all want economic development, they all want progress, and it's emanating out of there, right? And there's an intention to share that around the world. And there's now $2 trillion worth of infrastructure contracts been signed under the Belt and Road in 10 years. $2 trillion. All those things you heard about, like, debt trap diplomacy, if it was true, the countries wouldn't be going back. They wouldn't be lining up at these things. But they are, right? Because it's a different model. As I referred to at the beginning, there's a clash of systems here. It's a different system, and we have been conditioned and brainwashed, almost Pavlovian, to fear and hate it. And we should stop that, because we're robbing out. Don't think of your own future. Think of your kids' future. Do you want a future where all we are as a country is the first to sign up to America's war? Or do you want a future where, hang on, we can collaborate with our neighbours for peace, and we can actually have some spectacular results if we just stop and invest in the kinds of things that's possible to invest in terms of infrastructure and industry and space and energy and all those sort of things, which most of the world want to get on with, but we're stopping them.
Yeah, and it's interesting if you look at the weight of numbers between, if you like, the BRICS Plus, and
Yep.
the Western philosophy. The pendulum is certainly turning, isn't it? There are more people now saying we need to find an alternative route. We need to find something that doesn't actually make us so dependent on the US dollar, and the fact that a strong US dollar benefits the US over and against everybody else. And so there is a sort of set of economic consequences of this pressure. And I guess my point, Robbie, is that it goes back to, you need to understand what's behind the message. You need to understand the assumptions that are driving the messages that you hear. Because, of course, in this era of social media, people just grab the headline without actually understanding why the headline is saying what it's saying. And I come back as a philosopher. I want to know what's behind the behind. I want to know what's actually leading people to take the positions they are and the decisions they are. And I guess I come back to this fundamental question: is, are the decisions that the Australian government or the UK government actually benefiting the people in the country? Or are they part of another agenda, which is unfortunately not necessarily in the interests of ordinary people?
Well, yeah, and there is a pure evil element in the world, and I think people need to, look long and hard at that. And what I'm trying to talk about tonight is real stuff, Martin. You could get off into tangents about other things that people consider evil as well, but I see less evidence for those. But I hope people can actually take stock that war is the greatest evil. There is 2 wars going on right now in the world, and they both have a context. They didn't start on the 22nd of February 2022 or the 24th of February 2022, and they didn't start on the 7th of October 2023. They both have a context, and they both have the element of vested interests who want those wars. And the elements, the vested interests who want wars, well, to me, there's your definition of pure evil, right? So you got to look at that, and then you got to look at what can the world look like otherwise. And so, just on the BRICS, think about the BRICS for a minute. So now it's the BRICS plus, the original 5 plus 6 others. 2 of those 6 are Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, hell has frozen over. Seriously, the 2 biggest implacable enemies of the Middle East, outside of whatever countries might be enemies with Israel, the two biggest implacable enemies, right? We did all this work about 10 years ago on the Saudi role in 9/11. And the influence, and that led us to an understanding the influence of the Saudi government in the UK and the kind of the symbiotic relationship there, which goes back to colonial times. Anyway, I remember there was this memorable quote from one of the princes of Saudi Arabia, who actually is someone who should bear some of the responsibility for 9/11, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who told the head of British intelligence that as these Wahhabi Sunni Muslims that Saudi Arabia sponsored gained in power, he said, God help the Shia, because their greatest enemy was the Shia Muslims, and their whole intention was to wipe them out. And of course, that's the biggest Shia Muslim country is Iran. And these two countries have been absolutely implacable enemies, but they are now both members of the BRICS. And before they joined the BRICS, China was able to broker an actual peace deal between the two of them. And I think it's a more significant peace deal than, Egypt, Israel, right? Begin and Sadat. How did that come about? Well, both countries, based on where they're at, were able to recognize that they had more to gain by joining the economic progress current in the world than anything they got out of their shared enmity. And so looking at this here's this, this intractable enmity between them. It couldn't be broken until a third element came in, which was the prospect of unprecedented economic development. And both of them wanted to join that. And I'm actually worried that if there's a, it's not all clear yet what's happening in Israel, Gaza, but if there are people sponsoring that, if there are forces sponsoring that, they would love that to send fractures throughout geopolitics and break up something like Saudi Arabia and Iran again, get it back into this enmity. Because otherwise, if those two countries can join the BRICS and 140 other countries have signed up to the Belt and Road, and then you got these other blocks like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization across Central Asia there, two of whose members are China and India, and we're told China and India are enemies, but they're both members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they have treaty obligations to each other that are legal and under treaty registered at the United Nations, and far more fundamental and binding than anything India is doing with the Quad, for instance, that we trumpet, India's part of the Quad. These other structures like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are also bringing people together, and there's a Eurasian Economic Forum that has formed as well. One of the features of these things is when you hear about these conferences, like I can't name it specifically, but about 3 months ago, there was a big conference in Moscow on one of these Eurasian things. There was about 40 African countries at this Moscow conference. 40. I mean, there's some maps you can see on social media at the moment where people have drawn these maps to make fun of people like Biden and Albanese when they say the world condemns Russia or the world stands with Israel. And I don't want to make this about Israel, but that's one of the, and the map shows what they call the world, and it's United States and Canada, Europe, and down here on the other corner, Australia and New Zealand. And our leaders have the hubris to call that the world when it's a third of the world, if that. 2/3 of the world are looking at the world in a very, very different way, and not because they're ideologically communist or something. In fact, it's the opposite. Back in the days of communism and the communist capital divide, the communists had to console themselves with some kind of sense of purity because economically they weren't doing as well as the capitalist countries, and that's why it eventually fell apart. This is the opposite. It's that other larger block that is doing the best. They're the ones that are progressing economically, and we're missing out on that through our small-mindedness, which I think Australians need to think through.
Absolutely. And, there again, it goes back to there are different perspectives that people need to at least explore, sort of open the can and have a little think rather than just take that top line view as gospelly correct. And I guess, Robbie, in fact, somebody in the chat suggested we talk about Chen Lei, right? And it's probably worth just touching on that at this point, right? Because there's a bit of a backstory here that people may not know. And, there is more here than first appears.
Well, and the proof of that is when she was asked what she was charged with, she wouldn't answer the question. Now, so Walsum, I want you to think this through. She's back in Australia. She's served her time. Why can't she answer the question what she was charged with? There's nothing the Chinese government can do to her. This is a pretty straightforward question. So she was convicted. She served a sentence. She's back in Australia. Why can't she answer the question? Well, I have a theory why she can't answer the question, which is what we suspected all along. There is good reasons to think that the Chinese charges against Chen Lei were legitimate. I would say she was probably set up, but given the timing that it happened, Chen Lei was probably set up by an Australian intelligence agency and got caught. And she might not have even known what she was being set up for. But if an Australian intelligence agency was involved, it wasn't. We were told that she broke an embargo by a few hours. Well, if she broke that embargo to give information to an Australian intelligence agency, then that's a whole different story than just blurting out something on TV 5 minutes early before an embargo. And by the way, in a country like China, they do take, if they've put an embargo on something, I'm sure they've done it. I'm sure they take that sort of thing seriously. But anyway, so an interesting fact also that people should know is Chen Lei is a dual Australian-Chinese citizen, and that's only recognised in Australia. China does not recognise dual citizens. So China knew that she she was from Australia and she had kids here. China knew all that, but China treated her like a Chinese citizen. And yeah, why do we suspect that? Because in 2020, when the news broke that Chen Lei had been arrested, there are other things happening. And it broke in the context of these two white Australian journalists, Mike Smith and Bill Birtles, famously having to flee China because they feared they might be arrested, and that was all the biggest beat up of all time. And we have a lovely website with lots and lots of articles where we report this stuff in real time at the time. But we found out when the news of Chen Lei broke what the media had already known but hadn't reported, which was that 3 months earlier in Australia, Chinese journalists had been raided by ASIO. The media knew that. People like Nick McKenzie in The Age knew that ASIO had raided Chinese journalists in Australia, but didn't report it. This was kept secret until the news broke that Chen Lei had been arrested in China. Now, the Chinese authorities would have known that ASIO had raided Chinese journalists in Australia, but how compliant is our media, our wonderful free speech media? Hey, if your Australian intelligence agencies can go around and raid journalists and tell you to shut up about it, they happily do that. Remember Annika Smethurst having the AFP going through her underwear drawer? We've got a very compliant media in Australia, our wonderful free media. What a lot of garbage. It's all absolute, utter garbage. And the other bit of context that I think is very relevant is that that was September 2020. In about November 2019, a major event had happened in the United States. And that was China's main trade delegation went to Mar-a-Lago, and they sat across a table from Donald Trump. And they reached over and shook his hand, and they agreed to a deal. And that was the deal that China had agreed to buy $200 billion worth of extra exports from the United States after Trump had badgered them to and browbeat them into doing it. And because China values its American market, it had allowed itself to be browbeaten into doing it, and they agreed to sign the deal. Now, Trump wrote the art of the deal. I think we saw, and I've got a view of him. I think I saw enough of him to know. I can say confidently that, like with, say, the other example is Kim Jong-un. Trump's the guy that's all sound and fury signifying nothing before the deal, and once he gets his way, he's your best friend, right? So as far as Trump was concerned, he got his way. China's tops again. He got them to buy an extra $200 billion to help American industry. That was great. He was happy. But while that handshake was taking place, someone in his administration, and I'm absolutely sure it wasn't him, and he wouldn't have known about it, someone surrounding him, including some of the most despicable human beings in the history of the world, like Mike Pompeo, somebody called the Canadians and said, arrest the daughter of the founder of China's greatest company, China's flagship corporation, the most successful thing to come out of China, Huawei, the thing China is proudest of in the world. The founder's daughter is in Canada, arrest her. And they did. Now, Australia had taken the lead in demonising Huawei on behalf of the United States. We had set the tone on that. We lobbied countries not to use Huawei products because we'd set the tone on that. And people like these, there's a bunch of, pro-American sycophants in the parliament who call themselves the Wolverines. They were the most aggressive in saying you can't use Huawei. Huawei is a security threat, etc. So that's a lot of that is what caused the bad blood between Australia. At a certain point, China got sick of us, right? And we were actively undermining its economy. And this so-called trade coercion that we've been whinging about, that was some of that was a retaliation to it. But did we complain about Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the Huawei founder, being arrested? No, not. It was entirely legitimate when we did it. When our ally did it, we didn't protest once that Canada had done that. And then, so the problem is when you're dealing with a country like China, you're not dealing with Bangladesh or Tahiti, right? China, one of the things that China's trying to do at the moment, in as sort of as temperate a way as possible, but as a very pointed a way as possible. And they're saying to the United States, if you say special rules apply to you, then you can't tell us which rules apply to us. And so if China's going to be treated in a certain way, they will respond in a certain way. So anyway, that's the context. I don't know why Meng Wanzhou Cheng Li was arrested, but that's the context in which it happened. Chinese journals were being raided. It was the worst time in the Australia-China relationship. And either one or two things is true. Either she was genuinely, and probably if she was probably set up, because I don't, but there was something genuinely was wrong. China did genuinely convict her and then release her because she served her time. That's either that's true, or she was essentially some kind of a hostage to this deteriorating relationship with Australia. If that's true, then the other factor there is what a pack of arseholes our government was at the time, because they had gone so far down the path of sucking up to the United States on this China question and doing America's bidding. When Scott Morrison came out in April 2020 and demanded an inquiry into Wuhan and the origins of COVID, he didn't just say we should have an inquiry, we should try and get to the bottom of how COVID. So he didn't say that. He demanded that China open up access to the equivalent of nuclear weapons inspectors with those powers to tell the Chinese what to do. That's what he demanded. And he did that straight after a phone call with Donald Trump. And the Chinese aren't idiots. They saw what he was doing. He wasn't expressing Australia's view. He was expressing that view, right? And so at a certain point, the Chinese said, we can't deal with this government. They're a bunch of lapdogs to the United States. We're their best customer, and all we get is absolute insults. And by the way, just to backtrack, people might have heard about the international health regulations. of the World Health Organization, and there's an attempt to amend them. So if you've heard of that attempt to amend those, and people are alarmed by that, the amendments to the international health regulation, they're going to give the WHO more power. Do you know what those amendments actually are? Those are American amendments based on doing what Scott Morrison demanded back in 2020. That's what those amendments are. The affront to China's sovereignty that Scott Morrison demanded, they want to make permanent. The Americans want to make permanent in the international health regulations of the World Health Organization. So if you oppose that because you have some sense that would be dangerous to Australia giving up our sovereignty to the WHO like that, then don't bloody think Scott Morrison did the right thing by demanding that investigation the way he did. It wasn't about an investigation. It was about maximum insult to the Chinese. And at a certain point, the Chinese said, well, bugger. And there was no ability for an Australian government to have any kind of behind-the-scenes negotiations on Cheng Lei's behalf. So the poor woman spent 3 years in prison in China. If there was an element, if there was a possibility of being able to negotiate her out, 3 years in prison because Australia decided not just to join with the United States, but to be a pack of arseholes. That's what I know about Cheng Lei. I'm very glad she's been freed. I'm very glad she's back. But now the other thing I have to point out is that the Albanese government and Penny Wong, when you compared the lengths they went to on her behalf, which was good, I'm glad they did, but just contrast it to what they've done for Julian Assange. And so, listen, people, get your prejudice out of your head. Objectively, on paper, the Chinese government is a nicer, friendlier, more respectable country and government, especially to Australia, than the United States. That is a factually true statement. And you would only not believe that if you don't want to give up your prejudice about China. That's just factually true. We've been treated with more respect by the Chinese government than the despotic, authoritarian Chinese government than we are by the wonderful pillar of democracy, the United States and the Biden administration. That's what's happened. One more comment. There's another guy we're being told about is still in China in jail. He does not count. Get that out of your head. If you're hearing them talk about this other guy, that is garbage. That man who's in jail in China is actually a former Chinese spy. He was a spy for China. He left China and lived in Australia and the United States, where he hung out with our spies and ASIO, and the CIA in America. And for whatever reason, against his friend's advice, he chose to go back to China. Well, do you know what any country does to their former spies? They don't greet them with ticket parades, right? So that guy is a whole different kettle of fish, And it's only these people that are just trying to look for any sort of ridiculous pretext to stir up trouble with China that are even mentioning that guy. That's the truth about that guy. The reality is Cheng Lei's back in Australia. Good on her. I'm really glad. I'm very, very happy for her. And I only wish it could happen to Julian Assange.
Right. Thank you, Robbie, for that. And now, before we close, I want to move on to one last topic, and that is back to the financial system, the purpose of use of cash and the branch closures. Now, you know, the regional inquiry has been running. There's another one, I think, another hearing in November. I think, was it 1 November in Canberra? I think that's the next one.
1st of December, Martin.
1st of December. Sorry, I've got them. Yeah. And then they're going to do some more. So they've extended the term. I think that this has really cast a whole spotlight on the whole question of you know, the way the banks work. They've got no interest in making sure that they've actually got a presence where people need to bank with them. It's all about profit. The other side of that coin is they're actually now starting to get quite desperate and are actually cutting staff left, right, and centre to try and maintain their profits. And of course, the financial system more broadly is now exposed to a massive hole, and that hole is because many of them were holding bonds which were worth a lot more then than they are now because of where the interest rates have gone. So I have the view that the financial system is actually getting more and more wobbly. So in the context of a financial system that's not fit for purpose, what do we do about it?
Well, first of all, recognise the the superiority of the physical economy to the financial system. And so you have to focus on the physical economy first. Are we growing enough food? Are we building enough houses? Do we have sufficient energy? Do we have sufficient good enough infrastructure? Are we developing our infrastructure, etc.? That is the real economy. And if we were thinking like that and organizing our financial system to make that happen, because at the end of the day, that is what a financial system is supposed to do, and we had that clarity, I think we would see what we do about the financial system. And there's a really simple way to think about it. Preserve what's real and let the rest go. Think in those terms. Preserve what's real and let the rest go. So, for instance, if there was ever a massive property crash in Australia, we have a proposal that we've a detailed proposal to use the power of the Reserve Bank to make sure all homeowners keep their principal abode, not protect investment properties, etc. You can't do that, but you can stop people from losing their homes in that kind of scenario, right? Because that's priority. That's what's real. And it's as you see, you think about problems in those terms, and the question of a bank and a national bank is actually brought into stark relief by one of the things you've said. The fact that central banks can be in the red like they are, and Australia's is like over $40 billion in negative equity. Well, there's two parts to that. It is because it can be, because that's the unique quality of a national bank. Our Reserve Bank is the government bank, right? And when that government bank was started, the origins of that, the Reserve Bank, was the Commonwealth Bank in 1912. And the day it started, and in fact, my wife has the history book in there. Sorry, honey, can you bring me that book for a second? Let's see if she hears me. When that bank started in 1912, the governor of the bank, Sir Denison Miller, gave a speech to the staff, and he said, "We are starting this bank today without capital, because we are backed by the full wealth of the people of Australia, right? i.e., the nation is behind this bank." And that's the defining feature of a national bank. And the Reserve Bank is the government bank, and so it can be $40 billion in the red. My wife mustn't have heard me, so scratch that. We'll do it again another day. It's a great book, though. We got this book. It's a very old book, which was was written in the 1920s. It was the history of the Commonwealth Bank for its first 10 years, and that quote I just gave was out of that. The other side of the negative equity, though, is why? Because the bank, as part of its QE program that started in COVID, bought all these assets from the private banks, as with created money, QE, quantitative easing, to prop them up, and those assets have collapsed in value. So the bank is carrying the can for the public bank is carrying the can for the private banks, right? Well, so if the public bank can do that for the private banks, just so they can, these banks that don't really contribute much to the good of Australia, in my view, why can't it do that sort of thing for the things that do contribute to Australia? And that's the logic, Martin, behind what a national bank's supposed to do, behind a bank like a national infrastructure bank. Because a national infrastructure bank can build infrastructure that's good for the country, but doesn't make a 12% annual return like Macquarie Bank demands on its private toll roads in Sydney when it designs the financial structure for the private toll roads in Sydney. It demands a 12% return. Well, we didn't build Australia with that kind of thinking, right? The whole purpose of the infrastructure is real good infrastructure is so the economy can make a profit, not the infrastructure. And often good infrastructure can run at a loss. Who cares as long as the economy's making a profit and the government has the capacity to actually carry that? But no, governments were brainwashed by neoliberals to think they've got to function like businesses, and none of that mattered anymore. But it would be okay if that applied across the board, but it doesn't apply to the banks, because we have an example where the government bank is actually propping up the profits of the private banks and carrying the losses for them. So clearly it was all a fraud. Neoliberalism was always a fraud, right? See through it, scrap it, and let's say, all right, these are the priority areas in the economy. Let's get them going, right? That's what we've got to do. And with that kind of thinking, you can do all sorts of stuff. I mean, one of the questions that's come up a lot lately is, why can't Australia have 30-year fixed rate mortgages? Well, the reason why is because we have a different system to the United States. And now this might be oversimplified, Martin. If it is, and you want to correct me, go ahead and do it, because I'm sure you probably have a slightly better understanding than me. But so essentially, though, what the United States system is, the bank writes the mortgage to the borrower, and then securitization started long before the Salomon Brothers securitization that you might have heard about, that is in The Big Short. The original securitization was these mortgages were bundled up and sold to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government-backed entities, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac held that paper for the duration of the loan, and they rode out the fluctuations in the market because they were backed by the government, and they could do that, right? And so there wasn't a secondary market in these securitized mortgages. They were being held by these big institutions, and sometimes they decreased in value, and sometimes they increased in value based on the secondary market, right? But they didn't do that. They didn't participate in that, and that allowed these mortgages to stay fixed for the term of the mortgage. Well, that's what the Reserve Bank could do. That's what a national bank could do in Australia. They're essentially doing it to the private banks, but not so the borrower benefits, but so the bank can keep its profits up, right? So, that's an example. And then the other one is, bank branches. We've got we've done something really special this year, I think, with this bank branch campaign. And it was funny how like it's almost like I knew it was going to be, it's always good to get an inquiry into something, but it almost seemed small potatoes. Forgive me for saying that, right? We knew you and I worked closely with this, right? I remember, I'll tell the viewers, we got a call from Coober Pedy, the Coober Pedy Council, and this would have been in October, I think, last year. Coober Pedy Council, and they endorsed our postal bank because they'd just been told they were going to lose the Westpac Bank. And then in that conversation, they said, "Oh, is there someone someone in the banking industry that we could even consult with on some of this stuff?" And the only person I could think of was you, Martin, right? And so Martin and I, from that moment, were in regular touch with the Coober Pedy Council, and of course we're working closely with Dale Webster, who's been exposing the extent of bank branch closures. And Dale was getting increasingly frantic at the same time because these banks had just pulled out there had been this report from the regional banking task force that everyone thought was going to solve the problem. Instead, it just gave the banks a green light. And then Dale and Martin, you wrote the letter to the committee asking for an inquiry, and then we lobbied for it and we got it up. So my thinking, Martin, was this: if this is a big deal for the towns, a huge deal for the towns, right? And that's why you've got to have this inquiry for sure. But in the overall scheme of things, how big is the issue in that sense, right? And it didn't seem, the biggest possible issue ever. Let me put it that way. But what this inquiry has achieved in almost 12 months now has been nothing short of spectacular. We are seeing the banks sweat, right? We are seeing the fear in their eyes because I got a sense early on, Martin, that a lot of the problems that we complain about with the government letting these corporate interests get away with what they do is because the people who make up the government don't feel they have the right to tell these corporations what to do, right? They actually don't feel that's their responsibility or even their right. And I've been thinking for a long time, that's what we've got to change. And this inquiry and the public hearings where the senators on the inquiry are hearing from the towns and being affected by what they're hearing from the towns, and then hearing from the banks and seeing these banks all started off really arrogant, right? And then the senators responded to that in real time, and they got stronger and tougher on the banks. And then the banks, having not experienced this kind of treatment from a Senate committee before, they're starting to have second thoughts about, oh, hang on, this is something different. You know, like the first time the bully in the schoolyard gets stood up to, right? Oh, I didn't expect that. This doesn't compute. I haven't factored that in yet. And so then the banks, they start scrambling in all directions, right? Westpac says, okay, those 8 branches we're going to close, stop it, forget it. We're not going to close them. Just don't make us come to the inquiry again. That's actually what they said. We're not coming to the inquiry again. We're going to keep the branches open instead. Commonwealth Bank said, oh, we're going to keep our branches open, regional branches open for 3 years at least. Moratorium, right? National Australia Bank was harder to bring to heel, but you might have noticed, Martin, that in the last few weeks, since the Canberra hearing of the inquiry, Dale Webster's pointed out that there's been a hiatus in Westpac and NAB announcing branch closures, because NAB was announcing a few a week, right? And suddenly they haven't announced a few. They haven't announced any for a few weeks, and it's like, oh, maybe they're starting to get the message as well. And the difference is they're not used to being dealt with by these senators in this way. The kind of inbuilt obsequiousness they expect from senators and parliamentarians, especially major party ones, they're not getting. And in fact, they've got the opposite. One of the best senators, I mean, they're all good, but I'm most interested in Senator Linda White, who's the Labor Party senator, she sits there with a whip, and she takes she's Jesus clearing out the temple, the money changes out of the temple, mate. She intimidates them. And then the best part was when in the Canberra hearing in last month, when she took on Anna Bligh, and that smug, I want to use a bad word here, and I better not, but that smug piece of work, Anna Bligh, she was there like a politician. And the one I thought I made a joke, Martin, before Anna Bligh came to the hearing. I thought, in this inquiry, on this committee that's going to be questioning her, were 3 Queensland Conservatives: Malcolm Roberts, Gerard Rennick, and Matt Canavan. And of course, Anna Bligh is a former Queensland Labor Premier. And these 3 Queensland Conservatives would hate her guts, right? And I'm thinking, they're going to rip her apart. They're all mild. They're all polite compared to the Labor senator on the inquiry from her own party, Linda White, who ripped her a new arsehole. It was great to see. And Anna Bligh got a taste of the actual attitude change in this inquiry, and that has massive that'll have massive consequences. Because it allows things to be opened up that otherwise wouldn't. It shows the banks can be intimidated, for want of a better word, if the government actually does use its power, because that's the only entity that is more powerful than the banks. It's the government. And it might allow the masses to start realizing, well, hang on, ordinary people got this inquiry up, and it's had this effect. Maybe people do have power after all, because we're not just talking about winning on any kind of issue. We're talking about winning against the banks, right? Maybe people do have power after all. So that side of it has been a pleasure to observe, because I've been at every hearing, and it's just getting better and better. So I think, to the viewers who've played a role in this, pat yourself on the back, enjoy the process. And the good news is it's going to go on till at least May next year. They've extended the inquiry because it's doing so well.
Absolutely. And, it is interesting when if you can watch back some of the hearings and some of the evidence. And I was very impressed by some of the local councils and the evidence that they actually tabled, because, of course, it is regional Australia where, this whole linchpin is turning from, right? Because in regional Australia, you can't get access to, the digital services you can in our major cities. And I think for me, Robbie, one of the most interesting things was the gap between the bankers' understanding of what it was like out in regional Australia. And what it was really like in regional Australia, it was like they didn't have any idea, because they were being driven ideologically top down from, we got to save money, everyone's going digital, we got to close branches. When in fact, the people out there in the towns were saying, we need cash, we need access to cash because it's still part of our economy. We need access to branches because we can't travel 600 kilometers to go to the next one. So it really brought it out into sharp contrast. But it really, to me, it's the thin end of the wedge here. This is actually now becoming a much more critical question about how does banking serve the needs of real, ordinary Australians and small businesses into the future, right? And how do we get the investment that we need in the things that are critical for our future? Because it's not just a matter of maximising the bank's profits. There's another agenda here now, which is about the future of society and the future of Australia. And for me, that's a good thing.
Oh, for sure. Look, this inquiry is the front line in the war on cash. There is a war on cash. This is the front line. But I want to pose a thought experiment for people. Think about how many headlines you've seen lately about banks closing, ATMs being ripped out, and cashlessness and predictions of the cashless society. They're coming thick and fast. You're seeing them all the time. And I think that's part of the good development, because, like my comparison is to, if you're an alcoholic, the first sign of recovering is you got to admit you're an alcoholic, right? You got to define the problem. And what was happening before was the banks were allowed to operate on autopilot and just make these decisions that were forcing us down the cashless path. There was a government intention in 2019 to start the rot with the cash ban, $10,000 cash ban bill, right? But we beat that, and that was a spectacular campaign. And afterwards, remember we had this. It was a really good hearing in Sydney in late January 2020. John Adams addressed the hearing, and the room was packed. There was probably 60 people in the room to cheer John Adams on when he was the economist John Adams, when he was addressing this hearing on the cash ban. And the politicians at that hearing sensed that, this is something big, and they'd already been bombarded by the public, right? So I was confident after that we had succeeded with the politicians in making them aware that, you're not going to get away with legal changes to cash. You're not going to. But what happened was then they just went to sleep while the banks achieved their cashless goals, effectively making us to try and make us a cashless society. And they were doing it by taking away the avenues to cash, ATMs and bank branches. So now that is the topic of the year. Every time there's breaking news on it, it's reported all over the place. I've never been on radio so many times this year. Jason Bryce from the Cash Welcome organisation, his petition on change.org is now up to 127,000 signatures. And I remember in 2019 when the media was impressed that my anti-cash ban petition on change.org got to 50,000 signatures, right? So that's up to 127,000 signatures. That's going gangbusters. He gets interviewed all the time. I was just on ABC radio before, but this time I was standing in for Dale Webster. She'd been asked to do an interview. So the media is paying a lot of attention to this, and the only reason they're paying a lot of attention to this because they know people are very, very interested. And then you see all sorts of left field things like the Martin. Did you see the Australian? What's his name? There's a comedian in Sydney with a French name, John Bernard. Anyway, I think people would recognise what I'm talking about. He went to the bank, to a bunch of banks, knowing that they got to withdraw cash, knowing they're going to ask him what he wants it for, right? And he wanted to make fun of that, and so he's got all these bank operators asking him, okay, what do you want your cash for? Of course, most of us want to say none of your business, it's my money. But so he just came up with all these funny answers, like anal bleaching is the one that got to me. And the bank staff they were just going through the motions. They're supposed to ask the question, but that's just one of the examples of people. Thanks, Karen, my friend Karen. Don't shoot. So thanks. Love the t-shirt, Robbie. Hands off Assange. Don't shoot the messenger. the there's a young guy in Western Australia who got debanked by Westpac, Crispin Roveri, and he started his own petition on that, which was a really intelligent petition. And so this sort of phenomenon is popping up everywhere, right? And yeah, I think we've got this where we need to have it in the public consciousness. So that, combined with the fact there's very powerful Senate inquiry going on at the moment, we're kicking goals in this area, and this is the front line in the war on cash. And the final comment I'll make on it is that it comes down to that practical question of what is the banking system supposed to do? Because I am more convinced than ever from this experience this year, Australia cannot function without cash, not just in the regions, but especially in the regions. We won't have an economy without cash. We are too exposed to natural disasters, right? Anything can go. Technology is not reliable enough. So you need cash to have a functioning economy, which means you need banks. And if the banks don't want to provide the thing that makes the economy work, then they are not doing their job. And then that, if the government has two choices. They can either force the banks to do it, and the governments are going, oh, we don't want to tell a private company what to do. Well, good. Don't tell a private company what to do. Do what governments in Australia did for over a century before they became neoliberal idiots, and start a public bank again. Let the public bank do it. And then you watch these private banks scramble to compete with that public bank, and probably even reopen branches, because they know that otherwise they will lose their customers to the public bank en masse. And that will be more effective in reining them in than almost anything else you can do. And of course, that's what we as a party hope to educate people on in this process. And I think we're well on the way to doing it.
Thank you, Robbie. Well, that was pretty much the end of the time. I think that the message, is it's important to understand what's going along below the waterline in terms of the underlying drivers and philosophies. There are some worrying signs around the place, but there are also some green shoots. And I think the cash and the inquiry is a good example, showing that actually it's a spotlight into a bigger, broader issue. And it comes back to democracy, and it comes back to what people say. And if enough people articulate the need for cash, if enough people articulate the need for branches, our politicians begin to develop a spine. And then guess what? They can actually work for us rather than for just the big corps at the other end of town. So I want to say thank you very much. If people want to find out more about what you guys are doing, where do they go?
Go to our website, citizensparty.org.au, or the Citizens Report on YouTube, our weekly show. And I'll also just mention that we've been encouraging people. We can probably put this link below. There's a government bill at the moment to regulate digital payments, because different forms of digital payments are emerging, and it relates to things like once upon a time the whole payment system revolved around money, but now you've got things like crypto, and it's about, there's things in there to do with definitions of whether they're money or not, but nevertheless they're part of the payment system, and so there's forms of regulation on that. Without expressing a view on the bill, because I don't really have a view on the bill per se, that's not why we're doing this. But the fact that there's an exposure draft consultation on that bill is an opportunity for people who care about this issue to actually use it to say, yeah, I'll send an email to that to say, whatever you do with that bill, you must also protect cash. So use it as an opportunity to hit them on the cash question, right? So we've put out a release on that. We can provide the details too. Please do that. And as you just said, Martin, also, I think get into the habit. Every time you have a beef on something like this, it gets up your nose. Once you've been on Facebook or Twitter or whoever you express it, vent it. Don't just stop there. Send an email to your member of parliament, even call them up, because we need to get in the habit of doing that. Because if we can just keep this cash and banking question up front, that will sink in. The Labor Party got elected with 32% of the vote or something, and they want to get re-elected.
and they've got to pay attention to this. So keep harassing your members of parliament, and it just helps the process.
Absolutely. Democracy in action. And I'm a great believer in democracy working for us. Unfortunately, there are many people who prefer to go and sit on the beach and, think it's too hard. But we know that actually the voice of the people ultimately is a very powerful voice if it can be harnessed and directed in the right way. And if we actually have our blinkers off and really understand what's going on. And that, I guess, is what we're trying to do on this show. And Robbie, thanks very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we'll come back and have another chat down the road as these things develop. But I wish you a good evening. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to close the show now. And thanks for all those in the chat, and thanks for all the super chats. Really appreciated those. Next week, Tena LaCandra is going to come back on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on out there in the real economy. And I'm sure we'll also get a view on Tony about gold and what's happening there, which is an interesting subject in itself. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this evening. Thanks for spending the time with us, and take care. Have a good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.